history of medicine. And so again, it is just wonderful to have, I believe Linda Wilson is with us today. She also is the director of the Humanities of Medicine program at UNL, and she's one of 2 Black women to lead such a program. And so that also, I mean, just there are so many reasons that she is just so exceptional. She is the director of the program in African American history at the Library of the Library Company, not Library of Congress, Library Company of Philadelphia. And she has, I shared a little bit about her internationally acclaimed book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, that I know has been translated into multiple languages. And just recently, she's a contributor. She has a chapter on the Fugitive Slave Act in Ibram Kendi's anthology that is best-selling. It's like meteoric in this way right now. So that's amazing. I loved learning, I didn't know this, that Dr. Cooper Owens is working on 2 books right now. One that features mental illness during the slavery era, and then the other popular biography featuring Harriet Tubman through the lens of disability. So with that said, I mean, I could go on and on, but just I will stop there and welcome Dr. Cooper Owens as she helps us to think further about intersectionality, intersectional justice, stand-in for Nebraska's focus this month. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much. It's always humbling to hear how good I sound on paper until you hear my cat start mewing in the background and my husband telling me, oh, you didn't water the plants. And so that brings you back down to earth very quickly. I am really happy to be here and to be able to talk about something, I have to be honest, other than my book. Before I wrote the book, I was a professor. I taught African American history and early US history, and I see myself just as much as a historian of medicine, but also a historian of US slavery and a historian of Black women's history. And so intersectionality comes out of Black women's history and Black feminist studies. And so I wanted to start with Sarah. I'm not sure if you wanted me to kind of go down the list of the questions. I'm not going to have any PowerPoint. It's very, very old school. Is that fine?
That's totally fine. The questions are just there as,
okay.
So yeah.
Okay. And feel free if you have questions, comments. I want this to be as interactive as it can be on the computer screen. But the first question Sarah posed as a kind of framing question is, from my vantage point, what does intersectional justice work involve? And I really had to put on the historian's cap, because I always think about point of origin stories. So genealogies are very important to me. And I know it's a buzzword. I know everybody's kind of talking about and around intersectionality. It seems like it's kind of losing its cachet among the far right, and they're now focused on critical race theory, but there is a connection. Intersectionality comes out of critical race theory. And so many of you know, I know I'm preaching to the choir, intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a law professor both at UCLA and also Columbia University. I remember being a UCLA student and kind of seeing her on campus and being in awe, and never really speaking to her, but reading her work. And in fact, she comes from a cohort of critical race theorists. UCLA had a lot of them. Kimberly Crenshaw, Devin Carbonado, oh my goodness, I'm seeing the other woman and I can't remember her name, but there's a little cohort. And there was also another school of critical race theorists coming out of Yale School of Law that included kind of the grandfather of the entire movement, Derek Bell, who is now passed on. So Kimberly Crenshaw creates this based on academic work. And outside of law schools, and I was getting a concentration in addition to the PhD in a women's studies program. So really, I learned about intersectionality, not even in my history classes, but in my women's studies classes, and learned that it was about the plurality of identities, right? How identities intersect. how you are to bring those identities with you in the room, but not necessarily do the kind of thing that we've been taught as Americans, right? And individualize this, but that it's really communal, that it should be something for the greater community and for society, right? And so intersectionality, at least according to Crenshaw, meant, right, the ways that race, class, gender, because she was, and I'll get into the case, she was talking about how all of these intersect, how they overlap with each other. Right? And she writes about this based on a court case, because she's a law professor, right? And it was a court case. I'll see if I can, Sarah, if I could just share the screen just briefly. It was based on an article, right? And the article was about, thank you very much. Let's see here. It just needs to be disabled, but I can name the article as I'm talking. The article was published in a law journal in 1989, right? And it was about a Black woman who worked at an auto plant. And working at the auto plant, she essentially, she experienced discrimination, but the court found that in fact, her only discrimination, right, the only discrimination she suffered was via gender and not race. And Kimberly Crenshaw, as a legal theorist, right, who's steeped in critical race theory, is like, how does one disentangle their gendered identity from their race identity? But also she's working at an automotive plant. And so there's the issue of her being a working class person as well, right? And so intersectionality comes up in this space. And so once I get finished talking, I'll just put the link in the chat. But this is the thing, right? Point of origin stories are very important. And intersectionality and critical race theory is not just about the kind of discourse around these, theories that only, those in grad schools or professional schools talk about. But in her writing this, she was also providing a resolution. So there's always resolution and call to action work based in intersectionality. And she also didn't invent this in a vacuum, right? Black women had been writing about this, had been talking about this, had been discussing this, even in the academic realm decades before. So in the late 1970s and 1978, many of you have heard of radical Black lesbians called the Combahee. And I'm from South Carolina's Low Country, so the Gullah Geechee people, we say Combahee River, but it's the Combahee River Collective, and it was based on the river that Harriet Tubman had to navigate when she was doing liberation work during the Civil War, right? But it's spelled Combahee, C-O-M-B-A-H-E-E. But these radical lesbian feminists create the Combahee River Collective. In fact, one of the more well-known folk who is, kind of married someone who represents the system is Bill de Blasio's wife. Oh my goodness, what's her name? I think Charlene de Blasio, but she was a member of this collective in the late 70s, right? So they write this collective that talks about the kinds of multiple oppressions Black women face, and they include sexuality, right, as an intersecting identity. But they didn't create this in a vacuum. Frances Beale, right, who is a political activist, in her work with third world feminism, talks about the double jeopardy, right, to be Black and female. She publishes this political tract in 1969, right? So once again, intersectional justice work is wide-ranging, it's community-based, it is really about dismantling racial hierarchies. So for me, that's what intersectional justice work involves, right? It's organizational, not individualistic, it's resolution-based, but it's for the larger good of community. And ultimately, it's about dismantling any hierarchy that privileges one group over the other. And also recognizing the kind of historical disparities bound up in a system that was not created for fairness for all people who fell under the domain of those systems. The next question is, I think let me see, in what ways have I worked intersectionally on human rights issues towards justice? I mean, most of my work now, and I didn't imagine it would come this way. When one writes a dissertation, you don't know how it's going to be perceived. but I come from, before the PhD at UCLA, I come from a background where until I was 30, I grew up in all Black spaces. Imagine the reverse of Lincoln, Nebraska, right? Where Black people are like single digits in terms of the population demographics. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the 70s and 80s when it was known as the chocolate city. I mean, everybody in power and those who were not in power were Black, so you would see from the heroin user to the mayor to the superintendent, everybody looked like you. But Washington, D.C. is also a kind of small city. It's just a little larger than Omaha. And most of the folk, like my family, moved from the South. So even in D.C., my kindergarten teacher and my third grade teacher were my cousins from our little small town in South Carolina. Eventually, my mother's sister worked at my elementary school as a teacher. So, it was a space where I saw kind of the beauty and the diversity, the ugliness of Black people. And so I never quite understood these kind of stereotypical ways that people who look like me have been written about or treated. When my parents separated and divorced in the mid 80s, as DC was kind of going through a crack epidemic and a murder epidemic, we moved to the Low Country in South Carolina. So not very far from Charleston and those islands. And it's called the Gullah Geechee corridor where I'm from. So essentially we're the Black group in this country that has the most direct ties to West and Central Africa, which is why I look the way I look. And sometimes, if you know me well, you hear the Gullah Geechee dialect and language that I grew up speaking. So I moved there. Once again, it was about 90% Black. And then I went to 2 HBCUs. So even without knowing all of these fancy theoretical terms, I saw people doing community work, and that's what I based it on. So when I was writing a dissertation, I remember coming from an HBCU experience where knowledge wasn't just produced for knowledge's sake. It was always for the greater good of the community. And I also came of age in grad school and college during the age of Afrocentricity. And so everybody was really concerned about how to push the Black community forward. I mean, we had the Rwandan genocide and Rodney King and all of these things going on when I was in undergrad, and also OJ, I think when I was getting my master's degree. So there were always these conversations that had been amplified in public, kind of public media and in society, and the very things that people are saying now. Well, what can we do? We didn't know about this. I'm shocked at America. And I'm saying, like, no, you're not, because this has always happened, right? In my mother's generation, my grandmother's generation, we could go back hundreds and hundreds of years, centuries. This has always happened. So a part of me going to school was to figure out how my work could be used for the greater good. And so even though I didn't know all of these terms, and I certainly didn't know I would be doing work with regard to the Black maternal health crisis, I knew I wanted to write a dissertation that centered Black women's experiences, but that also, I'll just be quite honest with you, I figured maybe if we ever have a conversation around reparations besides John Conyers, the late John Conyers, who was always bringing the bill up to be discussed in Congress, maybe this could be used as a way to get universal health care for Black folk. I mean, that was what I was thinking. It was a kind of grandiose dream. I only knew about, at that time, INCOBRA was the group that was doing most of the work, in apostrophe, and then COBRA was the acronym. But I thought, maybe this can be used so they could see that there was something systemic or structural. Fast forward, after a couple of jobs, postdoc, a couple of jobs, and I end up in New York teaching. The Black maternal health crisis was afoot, but also these controversies around James Marion Sims, known as the father of American gynecology, his statue in Central Park. And my book had just come, was literally just dropping that year in 2017. And all of a sudden my life becomes transformed. And I'm no longer a Black history professor, at Queens College in New York, but now I'm the country's preeminent historian on James Marion Sims. And I thought, wait, this book is not about James Marion Sims. It's about the inclusive history of American gynecology. And it's about enslaved women. It's about poor Irish immigrant women. There's also an immigrant story there as well. But more importantly, I wanted to be able to have people think about the past in a way that resonates in the 21st century. Sadly, the dismal state of US medicine and healthcare with regard to Black women and birthing people showed that the stats were literally the same for Black women and Black birthing people experiencing maternal morbidity and mortality in the 19th century and the 21st century. And so this was a moment to say, instead of talking about James Marion Sims as the historical boogeyman, what we need to be talking about is what are the structures that create a system where Black women and Black birthing people are dying in such great numbers. Like, that's much more important. And so that's my kind of long answer to saying that's the way intersectional work happens, for Deirdre Cooper Owens, right? So when I'm talking to members of Congress, or whether I'm talking to community members or activists or artists or students or just interested persons, I'm always laying out the kind of structural and systemic ways that we can dismantle these damning statistics that are really harmful for Black people who are pregnant and giving birth. Also, let me just say this too, my work, and I think this is important as a historian, my work involves the living and the dead. And so there's something else that Kimberly Crenshaw, the person who coined intersectionality, wrote about and created. She talked about say her name. And so it's very important for me to be able to say the names, or at least tell the stories of those whose names, sometimes their lives have been lost to the historical record. So we only have fragments, but it's very important because, once again, you see the importance of community. And so it's never about these kind of individual stories, but what these individual stories can do to, you can see my cat in the background, what these individual stories can do to amplify the ways that we can better society. And so also, I think my work in reproductive justice is important because here you have the work of Black women activists, right, who coined this term in 1994. Toni Bond, Loretta Ross, they later go on to found Sister Song, which is still in existence in Atlanta, Georgia. But in 1994, they create a term called reproductive justice because they were saying, okay, all the pro-choice folk are talking about choice, but what if you don't have choice, or what if you have a choice, but you don't have access? And so, when I spoke to Congress about the Black maternal health crisis, as they were collecting information, I had to let them know access is really important. Where I grew up in South Carolina is a really small town, but it's the Blackest county in the state. It's also the poorest county in the state. When slavery ended, one of the richest counties in the state becomes the poorest county in the state, essentially. And I graduated high school in 1990. That's when the maternity ward closed at our regional hospital, not just in my town, for the entire county, right? So that means that if you live in Williamsburg County, you have to travel outside of the county, and this is a rural space, to have your baby. There are no doulas, all the midwives are dead. There's one OBGYN, and the way he treats you is impacted upon whether you have insurance or not. There's no public transportation. So what does choice mean if you don't have access to health care? And if there's no industry in the town, right? So all of these things become important for me to talk about, the ways that we have to expand a conversation with reproductive justice that doesn't just focus on the cities, but what about people in rural spaces, right? And lastly, I'll talk about the challenges. I think the challenges that we all face, and my hope is that we're all kind of on the same page, but the challenge is the ways that you have a really strong right-wing movement that has been, doing this work for centuries. Centuries broadly, but decades. So if we think about the emergence of the John Birch Society and the moral majority and all of these things, from the kind of era of McCarthyism, so we can start recently in the 20th century and think about that kind of 1950s, with the culmination of Reagan, Trump brings in another dimension. And we think about the ways that at the heart of the kinds of resistance that they've done for folk who they see as liberal, you know, it has always been about the attacking of ideas. So if we think about, at least from what I do, many of the people who wrote about very progressive movements in history, so whether it's Pan-Africanism or, you know, Black radical feminism, those ideas have been attacked. So when I think about Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, who decides in his 90s to leave the country and move to Ghana. When we think about the work that Kimberly Crenshaw is doing, when we think about critical race theory and the ways that it's been misinterpreted. In fact, it's just been falsified, right? That there's an idea that if you talk about race, then somehow that means that, you know, you are trying to put Black people on a pedestal in a higher, you know, this hierarchy that somehow diminishes white people. And critical race theory isn't about that at all. In fact, it's about the diminishing, right? The dismantling of racial hierarchies, the dismantling of hierarchies based on sexuality, gender, class. And so, you know, I think if we don't get a handle on actually defining things, I've spoken to members of the Daughters of the American Revolution, to the Sons of Confederate Veterans when I was at the University of Mississippi. And I can tell you, I used history. I didn't use tricks. I didn't use fancy wordplay. I literally used history. So for the Sons of Confederate Veterans, for instance, I would say you care about heritage. I was like, but I'm Southern as well. And in fact, my family has ties to this colonial space that was considered South Carolina under British occupation 300 years ago. I'm like, Mississippi only becomes a state in 1817. So I was like, if we want to talk about kind of Southern history, I was like, I'm more Southern and American than you are, if we base it on my own genealogy. And I was like, so if you care about heritage, I was like, then why is it when you go to, oh goodness, where the Civil War ended, gee whiz, in Virginia, the courthouse. I forget what it's called, the name of the town. Somebody can Google it, but it's like just, it slid out of my brain just now. But where essentially Lee surrenders. And I said, when you go back, all of these white Southerners decided what was important was the battlefield. What was important was the house, you know, where Lee and Grant and all of these military officers were. I said, but what people didn't realize was that was a slave space. And the entire town, Appomattox, that was it, Appomattox courthouse. Appomattox was almost 80% Black because it was a slaveholding space. What happened to the slave cabins? What happened to the presence of enslaved people? I said, do you know where they are? They are now the public restrooms at that national battlefield. So if you all really cared about heritage and history and fact telling, you would have never allowed that to happen, but you did. So where's your active, you know, where's the advocacy around the truth telling in that? They couldn't say anything, right? They clapped. When I spoke with the James Marion Sims Society at the College of Charleston, they clapped, right? At the end, because once again, I'm like, if you don't believe me, I have a whole book that lists citations and evidence, not from novels, not from creative fiction, but from the actual documents that the men I'm talking about left for us. So the backlash has to be us really saying, no, this is not true. This is not factual. In fact, this is what it is, right? And also not engaging with people who are foolish and who do debates for performative reasons and not real change. So I've been asked a lot, I mean, over the years to be on TV shows and have debates, and I never do. Because I recognize that debates don't change minds, they are actually performative. Nobody has ever seen a debate and said, I think I'm going to give up my lifelong membership in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party because my goodness, they changed my mind. Nobody does that because it doesn't work. It's all about performance. We already know who we're going to vote for. We already know what we believe. But I think if we go into it with honesty and transparency, about what intersectional work really means and continue to hammer home definitions, you know, not using the words hierarchy, but to say, actually, Republicans, Democrats, anarchists, whomever, you know, is committed to a world where there's actual equity, we should all be committed to dismantling power structures that are unfair based on, right, these isms that privilege certain groups, and to really talk about what that means. And so I'll stop there because it's 30 minutes and I want to have a conversation and questions. But thank you for allowing me the time to be able to just share some work outside of medical bondage. I love medical bondage, but sometimes I get fatigued always talking about medical bondage.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Cooper Owens. I've got copious notes and so many thoughts and questions. I know the rest of us do too. So if you want to go ahead and put those questions into chat, and we can take a look at those as people have a little bit of think time. I thought, you know, maybe we would think a little bit about where we are in terms of this civil rights movement, the 21st century energies that are advocating for change. In ways, it feels like intersectionality is a major answer in terms of the ability to effectively address dismantling systemic oppressions. You know, it seems like though there are lots of siloed attempts, you know, to push, and is that concerning to you? I guess where do you see the role of intersectionality playing now in terms of dismantling systemic oppression?
Yeah, I think we're like groups like this, you know, local groups matter, larger groups committed to a purpose where they're not necessarily swayed by the wind. So like, for instance, when I mentioned Sister Song, they've been committed to reproductive justice since 1994. That doesn't mean that they don't expand their thinking, but that's their focus. They stay in their lane. You know, when I think about Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined intersectionality, her African-American Policy Forum, she's a law professor. She cares about policy. And this comes from even her early work on the Anita Hill case, right? When Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, you know, were kind of the big topic in the early 1990s. So I think, you know, we have to kind of stay on task. I'm going to be, I know this is, I'm just going to say it. I think that in particular what I do in academia, and in particular with some Black academics who see themselves as scholar activists, I don't call myself that. I always say I advocate for reproductive justice in terms of the Black maternal health crisis. So that's what I do, and I do medical education for institutions and schools. I stay in my lane. That doesn't mean that I can't do other things, but that's what I'm choosing to put my energy on. There are my colleagues who are monetizing and commodifying activism, and they're lining their pockets, which is why I'm not saying don't buy 400 souls, but there is a way that I think about Ibram Kendi, who I actually like as a person, and Keisha Blaine, who's the co-editor, the ways that even in the kind of gathering up of scholars, that I know those with agents, those who are more well-known, didn't put in the work. And it's not because they're not smart people, but they don't write for a living, right? So they had their assistants do it, or they had Ibram and Keisha Blaine's assistant write it up for them. And then they got paid in ways that I didn't, that my colleagues didn't. And we're the people who kind of do this every day. And now you have folk who literally are writing books to get a TV deal, a movie deal. And so now when you have somebody saying the anti-racist coloring book, really, sir? The anti-racist coloring book, and doing GQ pictorial spreads to somehow amplify colon cancer, but you were the one who told us about your colon cancer, and in fact gave us a book list of how you got through it. So once again, is this about the movement and liberation, or is this about getting your name out there and surrounding yourself with people who are well known? And so I'm torn, right? Sometimes when people's names are out there, they get a lot of opportunities to do work. But once again, what are you actually doing in terms of anti-racism? I know what Kimberly Crenshaw is doing. She's going to Congress. She's working on policies. She's training up a community of young law professors who are committed to doing intersectional policy work to dismantle different segments of society that are, where these disparities are really more prevalent. So I know what she's doing. I know what Sister Song is doing. I know what National Organization of Women, is doing. I know all of that stuff. But I'd like to know what anti-racism means and what is the movement and what are you actually trying to change? And so these are conversations that, back in the day I could have had, but his schedule is really busy. So when he creates these institutions, right, at now, I think Boston College or the Boston University, I always get it mixed up, but I'm trying to see like are there interns, right? What's going to come out of it, right? Is there going to be a curriculum change for schools? What does this actually mean? What does anti-racism actually mean outside of speeches? So once again, something has to be rooted in the community for me. And I'm not necessarily seeing that. When I'm seeing a lot of my friends and colleagues whom I love on a personal level, becoming multimillionaires and getting book deals worth 6-7 figures and getting TV shows and movie options. So that's what I'm kind of seeing. And it's going to eventually stop because that's the nature of this, right? So it'll eventually stop. But I'm just wondering how we can shift, even in folk who are committed to doing this kind of Black liberatory work. How can we kind of intervene and have a conversation about, I think, the kind of individualistic concerns focused on commodification, when, at least for the people I talked about, they were commodified. So I don't necessarily like moving in that world. And it's complicated because I get paid for speeches, but I also do free work. So.
Well, and I'm looking at chat and I'm not seeing questions yet popping. Oh, wait, one new message. Yes. Oh, thank you so much. So yes, this is reminiscent of Amnesty International's process of including economic and social and cultural rights, women's rights as human rights in the traditional discussion of political and civil rights. The traditional was also heavily male. Women's reality was not present. Poor women were not present. Understanding of race was not present. So not purposely edited out, just presumed to be included without naming the actions, and campaigns were limited. So
Yeah.
further thoughts about that, Dr. Cooper Owens?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Susie put it all in a nutshell. I think that's what we're seeing. And also, as a professor, and some of you who work, with young people in different capacities, I meet, oh my goodness, especially in New York. When I was at Queens College, almost every one of my students was like, oh, I'm a social justice activist. And so I was like, oh, what organization? And they were like, huh? And I was like, girl, boy, your little tweet is not social justice work, right? Like, you have to, what's the organization, framework? What are the, how do you hold yourself accountable? So when we even look at what's happening with Black Lives Matter, and Alicia Garza is one of the founders of the network, Black Lives Matter, and there have been all of this criticism around her buying, these multiple houses in different places, and some of them have been really, really expensive, blah, 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 blah. And some of it is just, like some of it was just kind of a right-wing attack. But then there were others that I think actually we should sit with, right? So when Black Lives Matter Network first came on the scene after Trayvon Martin, and then very shortly after, Mike Brown happened, it was basically a love letter to Black people, and young Black men, young Black boys who had been killed. And then it becomes this network, and it kind of takes off. But a part of their framing is using the Ella Baker model of a leaderless organization. So sometimes the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Well, I study US history, and I think about the Civil War. And I remember their graphic designer, who's a mentee of mine, Walter Cruz, was like their first graphic designer / artist, kind of in the tradition of Emory Douglas, who was the artist for the Black Panther Party. But anyway, I was talking to Walter, and he's telling me about this. And I said, okay, you don't have, it's leaderless outside of these, New York chapter or Lincoln chapter or, whatever, right? Charleston, South Carolina chapter. And I said, so often the founders don't know what's happening on the ground. A, you can get infiltrated, which happened with the New York chapter. B, when you don't even have a board, what happens when money is exchanged? And this is where we are with Alicia Garza. So there are no financial statements. All of a sudden you just get tens of millions of dollars. And I actually believe her when she says that she didn't profit from Black Lives Matter. But where's the accounting? Where are the records? So that means every time I give a talk and I'm paid outside the UNL, I have to be able to present that information, right? So if I'm doing something for UNL, I can't mix it with the Library Company of Philadelphia. And then I can't mix those two with Deirdre Cooper Owens. And I always, at the end of every year, when I have a budget for UNL that comes out every month, when I give receipts to the Library Company, when I do my own stuff that goes to the IRS, I have to have an accounting. You created an organization and you don't even have a board of directors. You don't even have a simple CPA to tell us what happened with the millions of dollars. So there's something about a leaderless organization that sounds good on paper, but it's the way in which you execute it. You're gonna still have to have accountability. So where's the accountability? Because I can tell you, when they become board members of organizations, like Alicia Garza, Opal, all those folks, when they're becoming board members of organizations, I can guarantee you they have to be accountable to them. And when they create their own LLCs, they have to have their paperwork in order. But you didn't do this for BLM, and it's now exploded. So for me, when young people talk to me about, I want to be a social justice activist, and the only thing they're talking about is a tweet that sounds good or went viral, I'm like, you got to do more than come up with a kind of pithy slogan. What is it that you're actually working towards? What's the end goal?
I'm wondering, and I'm noticing a really great, a couple of wonderful questions, but can we just linger for a minute on capitalism, and just do you see it as anathema to systemic dismantling, that because we are so profit driven and individualistic as a culture, as you were exploring, will that ultimately, do you think, be maybe the major inhibitor toward coalescing around a movement that is for the social good and not, individual profit? So forgive me for interrupting the question stream. I thought maybe further exploring that would be of interest.
I think we have to, once again, I think class isn't really talked about, in this country in the ways that it needs to be. So I remember working at Ole Miss, and my students would sometimes have, and Ole Miss, kind of prides itself as the most conservative school in the nation, right? Like Tucker Carlson is an Ole Miss grad, just to give you some context. And so I would have students who would kind of say these talking points, and I would say, okay, what's socialism? What's communism? What's capitalism? What's Marxism? And I was like, put your hands up, I don't want to see you Googling it and tell me. And they couldn't. And I didn't delight in their ignorance, because it was my responsibility as an educator to say, okay, well, let's go through this and let's define the terms and let's actually see what they are. And then, this is Obama. I remember the Obama presidency, and I promise I'll get to the capitalism question. I was like, let's see who actually endorses him. I was like, guess what? Communists and socialists don't even endorse Obama. So how is he working for their agenda when the actual groups in the US who define themselves and call themselves like they're the major kind of communication organs for communists and socialists, they don't support him. So what does this mean? And so when my students started to see that, right, like this is how you conduct research. This is how you try and get answers, in an unbiased way, and not necessarily from sources that can be easily manipulated, and coerced into whatever it is, the person wants you because of your own implicit bias or my own implicit bias. This is how we can answer these questions. And they would say, oh, wow. It was a learning experience for them. So once again, just having people understand the different dimensions of economic systems and economic labor systems. And I think once we do that, we can have a serious conversation about capitalism. Because once again, to go back to Alicia Garza, she's a self-defined Marxist. She's a self-defined Marxist who just bought 2 multi-million-dollar houses, and one is in the most elite community in the Bahamas. And I'm like, sis, you can't call yourself a Marxist if you're making big moves like a capitalist. Like it doesn't, now you have the right to change your mind. But if you do, and you're a leader, you got to tell us that you've changed your mind. You don't even need to tell me why, but just tell me that you changed your mind. But you can't say you're one thing and do another. Because when people critique or ask questions, they deserve answers. Because everything that you're doing now isn't in alignment with the philosophical, kind of philosophical foundation that you set up for us to assess you by. We didn't say that, she did. So all I'm saying is, right, that you have to kind of, your mouth has to do what your hands are doing. So I don't necessarily know where we'll be on the capitalism question if people don't even understand what those economic terms mean in relationship to terms that seem oppositional. Sorry, my cat is just acting up. I see Carol's question.
Yes, about geographies. That's a really cool question. And she's a history teacher as well at Lincoln High. Yeah, that's wonderful. Like how have the various geographies influenced your research?
Yeah, it's great because it allows, now I can honestly say, outside of maybe Hawaii and Alaska, I've lived now in all 4 regions of the US and one foreign country, South Africa. And, it gives you a different perspective on so much. Urban, rural, what's middle class in LA, I learned is not middle class. In Lincoln, I learned, when I moved to LA, I had always been in kind of Black, white spaces in the South of the Northeast. And LA is not a Black, white city. California is not a Black, white space. And so having to be able to kind of renegotiate my place in a kind of geographic space where I wasn't necessarily the kind of oppositional person used, right? That Armenians don't think of themselves as white per se. And I was like, what? So there were all of these, I think, wonderful lessons that I learned and wonderful experiences. In Nebraska, it has been really different. I've never really had to think about Indigenous communities, I think, in the way that I have here. Because when you're in Brooklyn, the Black people are largely from the Caribbean. They're not even really African American. So you have a huge African, like kind of diasporic community of Black people. So they're all from the Caribbean, Antiguans and Barbadians, Bajans and Jamaicans and Nigerians and Liberians. And so here, I remember coming to a department where there were a number of Native scholars, like who were actually Native people and not white people doing Native history. And I was like, what? And even an Indigenous man from Bolivia. And I'm like, huh? So even Nebraska is kind of, Lincoln is seen as this white space, and yet there's been diversity I've not experienced elsewhere. So that's kind of the kind of racial and ethnic part of it that I think is beautiful living across the United States. But I also know experiencing the academy, which is a weird space because I'm around people who have access to a lot of resources. And I'm in a space that allows me access to some of those resources, but not necessarily monetarily. So, I recognize that the academy was, in this country, it was meant for really elite white men. And then all of a sudden, in the late 60s and 70s, you start to have an academy that democratizes. And the academy, in some ways, structurally hasn't caught up with it. So, women who have children are penalized, people of color are often penalized. I just won a departmental service award. I haven't even, I'm the person who's been hired the most recent. So I just won a service award. I got my PhD in 2008. So even though I'm 49, I didn't come to grad school, to a PhD program until I was 30. I graduated at 36. So I was older. I was almost 10 years older than most of my classmates. I was the oldest person in my entire program during my tenure at UCLA in US history. So I have only been doing this for, this year will be 13 years. This, in fact, in May will be 13 years. And my CV is 29 pages, half of which service. And I work with people who've been doing this for 30 years, and they have a paragraph of service. So, and the thing is, and they live on Van Dorn. And I'm sitting here like, wait, I know how much people make because the salaries are public. And then I realized, oh, this is how, no matter whether I'm in Mississippi or New York or Lincoln, Nebraska, or Charlottesville, Virginia, or UCLA, how certain people are able to have a hold on wealth. And I have 3 jobs, and I can't afford to do what they do with 3 jobs. And so that was the other thing that moving around the country and being in academia also showed me about structures based around class and labor and generational wealth, that this is the family business and people like me kind of come into it. And so, it's been interesting also seeing that there are some things, it doesn't matter where you live, that I am with people who I used to wonder how they could take trips all around the world or live in these big houses. And I'm like, what am I doing? I still drive a 2007 Mazda 3, right? And I had all these extra jobs, and my husband had all these extra jobs. And then I realized, like, oh, they inherited wealth. They have trust funds. Okay. And that's been across the board. So those are things that if I had just stayed, I think, in my community in South Carolina, Washington, DC, I might not have ever been privy to that. And it freed me not to be so critical about myself, and not to be so critical about poor people, because we're taught to hate poor people in this country. And that's part of the structures that needs dismantling, right? Not that people can't inherit things, but that there needs to be equity for all people, period. But in terms of my research, it has, I don't necessarily, I deal with enslaved people and I deal with Black women, and my research is almost always going to be in the South. So I don't necessarily know if that has influenced my research in any broad way. I'm looking at Chandra. What are the challenges, if any, getting awarded grants in your field? In history, it's almost always about the postdocs, and so we're not like the sciences or STEM or even some of the social sciences that rely on these multi-year grants. I can tell you, in terms of my work for the library company, I'm able to do what I do with students and scholars and researchers because of 2 Mellon grants, and they were $500,000 each. So the first one, 500G, and that was before I came. This time we got, it was essentially extended for another 3 years, and they added on about another 50,000. So what we're able to do, we essentially get all this money, we do programming, and then we give it all away to people for summer fellowships and undergrad students, grad students, independent scholars. So we essentially do all of this work so other people don't have to pay for it. And for me, it is, I think that's probably the biggest challenge. Most academics in history in particular don't necessarily know how to apply for grants because it's almost always individualistic. It's almost always rooted to your research. And we don't do kind of like the big, multi-authored this and that, it's just kind of solitary. So the challenge at UNL that we're finally talking about is in the Department of History in particular, unless it's like a big fellowship, there has been some criticisms around, oh, well, it's not prestigious enough, so I'm not even going to let the dean know or the College of Arts and Sciences know because it's not prestigious enough, so I know they won't allow you to get it. Not recognizing that the people of color and women in particular do more service work. And so, so for instance, after this, I have 3 more meetings and they're all connected to service. And so I was able to get a fellowship since my postdoc. I hadn't had one in 10 years. And so I wanted to use that as a bargaining tool when I had a job here. It would also have allowed me to stay in New York for half a semester. And, I could pack and all of those things. My husband was in New York and I was essentially told, no, I'm not going to bring that to the dean because it's not prestigious enough. It has to be huge, Carnegie. And I'm like, but most people in this field don't get those awards, so here's somebody willing to pay me to do research for this project. And I was told, no, I couldn't even use it as a bargaining tool. So, that's the challenge, I think. Also having people say no when you get the opportunity. Yeah, Susie said, yeah, that's also a way to destroy good work. How might grant makers in the state most effectively support this work? Ooh, I don't, once again, I think I'm probably not the person equipped because, for the library company, I have someone who writes grants for me. So I just author my little piece. It's already a system and structure set in place to make it very easy for me. And also the Mellon Foundation asks you don't go to the Mellon Foundation. Because we were an institution founded by Ben Franklin, it's already considered patrician and elite. So once again, we talk about those structural opportunities. It's already considered one of the country's best because it was founded by a so-called founding father in 1731. So my work there in terms of getting money is fairly easy. And the former director who I replaced is one of her besties who runs the Mellon Foundation. I mean, this is the inside stuff. In terms of what you all can do, I would, depending upon where, if you went to school, I don't want to be presumptuous, I would maybe go to the Office of Alumni Affairs, ask, what resources can they give you for people who are willing to fund your organization. Sometimes I just do searches on people whose work I admire and I see what prizes they've gotten. And I'm like, oh, I need to figure this out. Okay, what do I need to do? I just, it's me being nosy. My degree was in broadcast journalism. So I still have that nosiness about me, and I'll just Google them and see what prizes they've won and what's attached to that. What do I need to do? But I unfortunately cannot give you any real kind of solid advice or names or websites. So I'm sorry, Mary, for that.
Well, and Mary comes from Humanities, Nebraska, and we were just awarded actually a grant to support our Roots to Rise program that starts this summer at the Indian Center and supports BIPOC adolescents in a summer enrichment program in the arts and humanities. And so I thought I'd put that little plug in. We're so excited about that. And so Dr. Cooper Owens, thank you so much for coming today. I'm wondering if we could do a little gallery view, and especially since this is our first opportunity to do a lunch hour luminary session, maybe we can take a little picture of our group and celebrate that fact as we're closing for today. I would love to see all of your faces if possible. Yes.
All the faces.
A goodly number of the faces anyway. All right. And again, also want to extend on behalf of the Stand In for Nebraska board, we are just over the moon, thrilled and so appreciative of your service as an external advisory council member for Stand In for Nebraska. It just gives so much fuel to us to know that there are just such incredible people like you who believe in women empowering women and really are getting behind that in the community. So thank you so much, Dr. Cooper Owens.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you all for taking the time out. I hope you had a good lunch.
Yes, and have an excellent weekend, everyone. Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.